Welcome to Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Is liberal a dirty word? And if it is, should liberals be thinking about why? Thomas Frank is here to talk about his new book, Listen, Liberal.
Michael Dukakis was the kind of ultimate case where he wouldn't even use the word. And they started calling it the L word because he refused to let it cross his lips.
What would make a new mother flee from her husband with their 6-year-old child? Lydia Millet will be here to talk about her new book, Sweet Lamb of Heaven.
Eventually this escalates into a kidnapping, and it actually even escalates further than that into a situation where he invades the privacy of her mind.
Plus, Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal and I will talk about what we and other people are reading. The word liberal has been said with a sneer for decades, so much so that it's gotten hard to say the word liberal without sneering. And that's pretty much the way Thomas Frank means you to say the title of his new book, Listen, Liberal, or Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. He argues that Democrats have become a bunch of overeducated elites who've forgotten their commitment to the working class. Frank is here now to talk about his new book. Tom, thanks so much for being here.
Sure thing.
So the title, very pointed one, I'm thinking of it as sort of said this way, Listen, Liberal, or whatever happened to the Party of the People. Did you have that title sort of up front and know that's what you wanted to call the book?
It should have had an exclamation point on it. I only, for some reason, neglected that until the very last minute. But, the book is an exclamation point. It comes from a number of sources, but C. Wright Mills wrote a book once called Listen, Yankee. And I was just thinking, I always think about this incident that happened in Wichita some years ago when I was supposed to do an interview with a guy, and he showed up at my hotel and rang the telephone, and I picked it up, and he said, it was early in the morning, and he said, "Rise and shine, liberal." And I always kind of liked that. It stuck in my mind.
Was that back when you were writing What's the Matter with Kansas?
Exactly.
So what has changed since that book, 2004, that came out, right? Now it's 2016. It seems like things are still wrong in Kansas and perhaps elsewhere.
Everything is a little bit worse. In some places, quite a bit worse. I think Kansas is the political scene has deteriorated quite a bit there from my point of view. Since that book came out, that was before the bubble and the collapse and the financial crisis and the Great Recession. That was before any of that stuff had happened. I mean, the housing bubble was going strong when I was writing that book. I remember it very clearly. Things have gotten much worse since then, and we've gone through a whole cycle of hope and disappointment with Barack Obama. A lot of the themes in Listen, Liberal are hinted at in What's the Matter with Kansas. In particular, the last chapter of What's the Matter with Kansas basically has the précis for Listen, Liberal. It's all there. But the events of the last 8 years have made this book necessary.
What is that précis in the last chapter of Kansas?
The Democratic Party becoming a party of the professionals.
Right.
And this weird sort of subtext to American politics that I noticed when I was writing What's the Matter with Kansas, which is this unspoken class war that people never really talk about openly, but that always seems to be there right below the surface, which is working people versus professionals. In the Kansas book, it comes up a number of times, with like the war over the theory of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Well, any number of the culture war disputes, there is a sort of hidden subtext of hostility to professionalism in these things, which I pointed out at the time. But that's an aspect of the book that I think only I noticed.
It's interesting because, at the same time that nobody talks about the working class, obviously we're in a moment where populism is a thing going on politically, even without using that phrase. But also in the last couple of elections, the term working families has sort of become like the way to refer to voters.
Yeah, you see that more and more. There would have been different terms 20 years ago, but look, this is politicians have always done this sort of thing, giving speeches at the big Labor Day parade or something like that. They always talk about working people. Whether they actually do something is a different question.
Right, and also, I mean, working families isn't quite the same thing as working people because there's the implication that families that work and therefore deserve things as opposed to those who quote unquote don't work and therefore don't don't deserve things.
Oh, I always thought, I didn't see it that way. I always thought it was a way of getting back at the family values, the phrase family values. So working family sort of turns that on its head.
We can all work in our own different negative interpretations of these kind of terms. But, I mean, the term liberal, did the left allow the right to demonize the word liberal?
Yes. I mean, you look back to, the days of Jimmy Carter. Carter didn't like being called a liberal. Well, in point of fact, he really wasn't much of a liberal. But you remember Michael Dukakis was the kind of ultimate case where he wouldn't even use the word. And they started calling it the L word because he refused to let it cross his lips until very late in the campaign when he was finally, he was losing pretty badly and he decided he would own it, and call himself a liberal. But by then it was it was a bad word. And I decided at that moment that that's what I would start calling myself, whenever a word becomes gets abused like that, that's when I decide I need to pick up on it.
Looking at the current election, everyone is sort of pointing fingers over, like, whose fault is Trump? Is Trump in certain ways the fault of the left? Do we have Trump because the left has done something wrong, left a vacuum?
Well, I wouldn't say the left has done something wrong. I would say the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Democrats deserve a big part of the blame for the Trump phenomenon. If you look at the number one issue that he talks about, it's trade. He's obsessed with it.
Right.
He talks about it all the time. The trade deals that he is describing, that are supposedly so awful are, one of them is NAFTA, which was the crowning glory of the Clinton administration. And by the way, when I say crowning glory, I'm not exaggerating. This was his followers, his friends, his admirers thought this was Bill Clinton's greatest moment was NAFTA. Or the other one that he loves to talk about is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is Barack Obama's sort of final reach for posterity, to define his presidential legacy. These are both prominent Democrats. Now, obviously, Republicans do trade deals too. Republicans sort of invented the modern trade deal, and this is what makes Trump such anathema, I think. Well, among other things.
Right.
This is what makes him so toxic to the Republican Party.
It seems that what's happened with mainstream Democratic sort of policy is that it's become the standard to be fiscally moderate or even fiscally conservative, or then, quote unquote, but liberally progressive or progressive in some way. But are those two things at odds?
Well, the people who run the Democratic Party don't think so. That's really who they are. It comes very naturally to them to be very liberal to the point of shrillness on social questions and conservative like a Republican conservative on economic matters. That is really who they are. That's why I wrote the book. I was trying to understand that, and ultimately the answer that I come up with is that the Democratic Party isn't who we think it is. You mentioned earlier the kind of the nice rhetoric that they use when they're talking about working families or at the Labor Day parade or whatever, but they are not the party of working people. They used to be very closely identified with working people, with organized labor, that sort of thing, back when I was young. Today, the group that they identify with most closely, the group that they actually talk about in these kind of admiring terms, that group is the affluent, white-collar professional class.
Mm-hmm.
That's who they love the most. That's the group that is closest to their heart. And if you look at the policy preferences of professionals, as a cohort, as a demographic group, it's exactly what you just described. Very liberal on social issues and conservative on economic issues. And that's who runs the Democratic Party. That is the constituency that they listen to. That's the group that all their leaders are drawn from, with a few exceptions.
So not to totally date you, but you said when you were young, things were different, and now they're not. Sort of when did everything go wrong?
Well, it started going wrong in the when everything else went wrong, in the late 60s and early 70s. The Democratic Party essentially decided to remove organized labor from its sort of structural position within the party. It was during the Vietnam War. It was in the aftermath of the riots in '68. But then that decision came out of a new way of looking at politics, where the working class was no longer, this is no longer what liberalism was about. It was no longer about working people. It was about these other issues and these other groups. Labor seemed kind of like reactionary to these
Mm-hmm.
people. And so you had a whole series of democratic reform movements. All of them, this is all through the 70s and 80s, but all of these groups, they disagreed on all sorts of things, but they all agreed on the idea that the Democratic Party had to leave the New Deal behind, and they had to leave this fixation with working people. That had to be left behind, and the group that had to be in the forefront. And amazingly, all of the different democratic reform movements agreed on this. The group that had to be in the forefront was this, white-collar professionals.
You talk about politicians, Democratic politicians as well as Republicans, as sort of using like innovation and education as these kind of buzzwords as to how to address problems. Is there something sort of fundamentally wrong with those responses, or are they inadequate?
Well, they're buzzwords,
Yeah.
Education and innovation, these are things that everybody admires. Nobody's against. It's like creativity is another one. Who's against creativity?
Right.
Who's against education? Nobody. And so what you find is that when you have an idea like that is universally admired and respected, that people will try to smuggle through all kinds of bad ideas under that rubric. And both of the things that you mentioned, innovation and education. I mean, innovation is the easiest one. I mean, the word is everywhere now. To write this book, I went to Boston. I spent a lot of time in Boston, and I was looking at what rule by Democrats actually looks like when you're not in Washington, D.C., when you're in a city in a state that's ruled almost completely by Democrats. And what it looks like is there's a cult of, a state-sponsored cult of innovation. They've got an innovation district, they've got, innovation this, innovation that.
Well, I was going to say, it's almost like the Silicon Valley corporate speak has pervaded politics.
That's right, and that's ironically how I got interested in politics in the first place. Is I was writing about, this is back in the 90s, I was writing about management theory. I was fascinated by Silicon Valley corporate speak. And, what all these sort of empty cliches, and what were they trying to do with these empty cliches, And now, here it is. It's in our politics. It's everywhere in our politics, where you ask a Democratic politician, well, what are we going to do about inequality? And they'll say, oh, innovation, that'll solve it, or education, everybody needs to go, spend 4 more years at school, and get that much more deeper into student loan debt or something like that. But these cliches have made their way into politics, but the point that I'm making in Listen Liberal is that they have a cost. There's a cost to not looking this thing square in the face and instead believing in these myths,
Before you go, obviously it's election time. So what's your take on Hillary Clinton, and what do you think liberals should be doing come November?
Well, Hillary Clinton is fascinating to me. She's a talented person, a highly intelligent person. I think she'll probably be elected president just because it's, the Democratic Party machinery. They really are the dominant party at the presidential level these days, and so their candidate enjoys obvious advantages. She is in many ways a paradigmatic Democrat for our time. It comes right out of the professional class. She talks about professional struggles all the time. She's very proud of her career as a professional, which she came up through fancy colleges, went to Yale Law School. She has the sort of life story of a highly successful professional, and she really believes the ideology. When how Bernie Sanders criticizes her for these speeches that she gave to investment banks, when she says, they didn't bribe me, I don't do what they tell me to do because they paid me to do it, she's absolutely correct. She does what they want her to do because she believes in it. Mm-hmm. This really is her way of looking at the world. And this is the point of Listen Liberal that I really want your listeners to understand. When I talk about the Democrats in Wall Street, or when anybody talks about the Democrats in Wall Street, they aren't. This isn't an exaggeration. The Democrats really have become a sort of a party of Wall Street. I say it's not the party of Wall Street because Wall Street is still slightly contested between the two political parties. Mm-hmm. But Democrats love Wall Street. Interestingly enough, they love it for reasons of their own, for reasons different than the Republicans love Wall Street. But, Hillary Clinton's admiration for investment bankers is very deep. This is something that is ideologically profound for her. It's not a matter of bribery.
Because it's an affirmation of that kind of elitist mentality that you're talking about?
Well, because investment bankers represent the sort of cream of the professional class.
Mm-hmm.
These are, I mean, if you look at their pedigrees, look at who they are. And by the way, before the crash, before '08, Democratic theorists used to always talk about Wall Street as the perfect example of what they like to call the creative class. You know, these white-collar professionals that they admire, that they want to reach out to, that they believe to be the base of their party. You know, these are people that Democrats admire.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that they don't prosecute these guys.
Right.
These are history's heroes, not villains.
I'm still one of those people that thinks of the creative classes like poets and artists. But
Yeah, where have you been?
That's right. All right, Tom, such a pleasure to talk to you.
Sure thing, anytime.
The book again is called Listen, Liberal, or Whatever Happened to the Party of the People by Thomas Frank. For some crazy reason, tales of new motherhood often feature a woman who seems to be going off the rails. And in Sweet Lamb of Heaven, we've got a mother who hears a disembodied voice and with her daughter flees from a sinister husband. Lydia Millet is the author of 11 novels now, and she's been a finalist for both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer. She's here now to talk about her new book, Sweet Lamb of Heaven. Lydia, great to have you.
It's such a pleasure.
This story centers on a kidnapping. Tell us how that comes about.
This is a novel about a woman who's in a pretty bad marriage and who's decided to have a child without the husband's approval, and who eventually leaves him with the child. But when he decides to become a political candidate in Alaska, she's now living in Maine with her little girl. He decides to hunt her down because he feels he needs a photogenic family for his campaign. And so eventually this escalates into a kidnapping, and it actually even escalates further than that into a situation where he invades the privacy of her mind.
All right. Before we get to that sinister development, let's talk about the happy couple at the center of this book. Who is Anna and who is Ned?
So Anna is I wanted to write her pretty straight. She's been a teacher in the past, a professor. She's in her 30s. She's kind of grown up in a pretty sort of normal American family in the sense that, she was maybe middle class or upper middle class, depending on how you define class. And she had a pretty sort of average life for someone in that demographic until she made a series of, or at least one, wrong choice. And I wanted her to be pretty straight and pretty authoritative. Sometimes maybe she's a little arch in her diction, but she's a rare sort of straight narrator for me. My bailiwick is more sort of the flawed narrator. When I'm writing in the first person, it's where I'm comfortable. But because this book deals with a fairly outlandish conceit, I needed a narrator whose essential reliability we wouldn't doubt too significantly. Mm-hmm. So that's Anna, and then Ned is this very extraordinarily handsome man that she married, who really is extremely cold and very sort of utilitarian in the way he approaches other people. He's been a businessman, and he's sort of all about profit, and he turns away from the marriage in pretty spectacular ways. He's a self-serving person, at least at the beginning of the book, and sort of becomes something more alarming as the story proceeds.
And he decides to run for office. Did you think about this as being a political novel?
Well, that's a good question. I admire novelists like Coetzee, who can sort of marry the political to the personal in a way that's sort of austere and elegant. I mean, I wanted to write about ideas of language and God, and those are subjects that need to be treated with some delicacy and nuance. God is dangerous territory,
right?
But nuanced ideas can be slow to read in fiction. So I decided to do it in a kind of psychological or even supernatural thriller context to try to balance a personal, suspenseful story with a form of speculation that I'm interested in around political power and the disingenuous use of people's genuine faith by a moneyed elite. And this speculation has actually turned out to be pretty germane in this election cycle, where we have both a far-right religious extremist and a billionaire who's managed to sell himself as populist, trying to be president.
Yes, and very tricky and amazingly successful at that.
Yes, indeed.
It's funny because we had Thomas Frank on the podcast earlier, and I want to read this quote from your book because it kind of echoes things that appear in his most recent book. He's the author of What's the Matter with Kansas, and he has a new book called Listen Liberal. So I'm quoting here from one of Anna's friends who breaks down the political system, and this is the quote. "Let me put it another way. There's money at the top and blue collars at the bottom. Far as I can tell, the money at the top talks about ending the separation of church and state, like Sharia, right, but Christian, end time bringers. They use this to get the blue collars to do their dirty work." Does sound like a political novel.
Yeah. Well, it can't help but be political in the sense that, we all know there's a significant cultural schism in this country right now between the secular and the fundamentalist or evangelical. And so I was interested in what a vision of a non-sectarian, non-partisan God might look like, one that's not at war with the natural world and not at war with science, because it's clearly a false opposition, Christianity versus science, one that's based in a pretty distressed misunderstanding. There's no reason a scientist has to be an atheist. There's no reason a religious person has to reject science. And so there's this trumped-up binary that feeds into a culture war that we really need to stop fighting very soon if we're going to tackle, for example, the crisis of climate change and the crisis of mass extinction. It is political by necessity.
You mentioned earlier that most of your novels tend to have unreliable narrators, and this one was different in that way. When you're approaching a new book, do you sort of think of it as part of this ongoing kind of project of all of your collected work, or do you try to do something different in each book?
I do like to do something new just to stay interested in what I'm doing, but I think there's a certain amount of continuity. I've had several books now where, in some form or another, I approach ideas about extinction, for example. I'm fairly fixated on the loss of species and what that matters to human culture. And so there's some continuity, but I never want to write the same book twice. And as I think I mentioned to you previously, it makes me fairly hard to brand as a writer. It's kind of a nightmare for publishers. But yeah, I do always want to do something that I find compelling, and I like not to know exactly where I'm going with a book when I start it.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you. Did you know where this was going? Because there's kind of a thriller-like tension to the book.
Right, and so there's a certain amount of plotting that has to occur, but it's not the kind of intricate plotting that you might see in, something like Gone Girl or Ton of French or something where everything has to be calculated beforehand. It's sort of, I think it proceeds more organically, even though it's in this sort of formal construct of a thriller. I knew certain things about where I was going. I normally just have sort of an idea of emotional texture or a certain kind of idea that I want to get to by the time I reach the last page of a novel. But I don't have, for example, a little outline worked out beforehand or anything. I used to do that when I was in my 20s. I tried to write that way, and it is, for many people, I think, a very effective way to work. But for me, I found it just wasn't as exciting if I was trying to work from a sort of pre-organized template.
Well, I think probably for the sake of our readers, I'll end it there so that we don't get rid of that excitement and we don't give away too much of the ending.
Good. Thank you. No spoilers.
No spoilers here. Lydia, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela.
The book again is called Sweet Lamb of Heaven by Lydia Millet, and it's reviewed this week in the book review by Laura Lippman. So here's a new thing we're trying. We'll be talking not only about the bestsellers, but also about our editor's choices, the books that we here at the Book Review thought were especially good, even if our reviewers didn't. Joining me now are my colleagues from the Book Review, Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
So let's talk about what other people are reading first. Occasionally it overlaps with what we're reading, but what's big on the bestseller list this week?
The most notable newcomers on the fiction hardcover list this week are probably down at number 16, Karl Ove Knausgaard continues his 6-volume autobiographical novel, My Struggle, the 5th book in that series, My Struggle, Book 5. is new on the list at number 16. And that has really become just kind of a phenomenon. Each of the last two books has hit the list. Book 3 hit the extended list. Book 4 hit the actual print hardcover list. And now Book 5 has joined it.
I actually think, like, even though many of the new titles on the bestseller often have like 27 previous volumes in the series, even though this one only has 4, it's probably a lot harder work in many ways, although perhaps more rewarding.
The 4 previous books equal almost 2,000 pages. So it could easily have been 27 earlier volumes.
Has either of you made it all the way through?
I'm in the middle of Book 5.
Wow.
I know. I'm
5
addicted.
points for Parul Sehgal here.
No. I wanted to be skeptical and cool, but I just fell very hard for these books.
I've read the first 4. I have not started Book 5 except to the extent that I needed to here at work. So I know what it's about, but I haven't kind of settled in with it as pleasure reading just yet.
All right. The next one on the list is probably a lot faster and easier going.
Yeah, there's a few other new titles on the list, but the other one that really seems of note is up at number 5, Curtis Sittenfeld's novel Eligible, which is her modern-day riff on Pride and Prejudice. She takes the Pride and Prejudice story. It's part of an ongoing project that the Jane Austen Society or a Jane Austen appreciation group has done. They've approached various authors and asked them to write new versions of the Jane Austen novels.
Which series do you think is doing better, that or the new versions of the Shakespeare plays coming out from Hogarth?
You say doing better, you mean just in terms of sales?
Yeah.
I think this is the first book on either of those projects to hit the list at all. None of the Shakespeare books have, and none of the previous Austen books did. They were all written by British writers. Alexander McCall Smith was one. Sense and Sensibility, I think, was one of the updates. But Pride and Prejudice is kind of the big Jane Austen book, and Curtis Sittenfeld is, as some of the other writers have been, is a known quantity. She's been a bestseller with, I think, each of her previous books.
Something tells me that Joe Nesbo with his Macbeth might also land on the list.
Yeah. So this one, she sets it in Cincinnati. It's set in the present time, and the title Eligible refers to a Bachelor-type reality show called Eligible.
And that's also one of our editor's choices this week.
It is, as is the Knausgaard.
All right, Parul, what are you reading, or what's good?
I was in the middle of sort of editing 2 reviews that are both on Editor's Choice, 2 books. One of them is Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are by Franz de Waal. The other one is The Genius of Birds by Jennifer Ackerman. John Wellham reviews them both in this week's issue. And while I was fact-checking, this thing started happening where I realized that, I'm not fact-checking, I'm reading, So I actually ended up taking both of these books home. And again, everybody who knows me knows that I have a notoriously soft spot for all things, small and fuzzy and cute. But these are really, first of all, the review is fantastic, but these books are also just so interesting, so well done. And both these writers write about animals and animal intelligence without sentimentalizing them, which is so hard to do.
Oh, my God. Can I just say that I saw on Twitter this morning a photo? It's some photographer has this project where she's trying to sort of revamp the negative perception of pit bulls. Yeah. And so there were photos. Did you see that?
I saw that.
There were photos of pit bulls with these floral wreaths on their head. And all I could think about was this Franz de Waal book and thinking, like, these dogs are too smart for this kind of treatment.
Yeah, but the book essentially makes the case is that we've been trying to measure animal intelligence with human parameters. For example, so we say that, chimpanzees aren't good at facial recognition because we've been trying to make them recognize human faces. So it's this whole upending of how we look at animals, how we look at intelligence, and they're just both full of like wild facts. For example, my last one is I think is it crows can not only tell the difference between Impressionist and Cubist paintings, but they can tell the difference between a Braque and a Picasso.
But which do they like more?
See, taste does not come into it, but yeah, so it's just full of like just wild, just great facts and beautifully written. And the review I would also really love to plug because I think it's a beautiful piece of writing.
Greg, speaking of beautiful writing and very funny writing, you just finished. Did you finish it on the train?
I did. I finished on the train this morning. I always have several books kind of going on the side for pleasure reading outside of work. And right now those books are, I'm reading a story collection by a Canadian author who died a few years ago. His name is Alistair MacLeod. He's from Nova Scotia. And these are kind of gritty, plain-spoken stories, many of them about the sea, seafaring or miners, But my train reading until this morning, when I finished it, has been a 1980 memoir by Clive James. It's the first of his several memoirs. It's called Unreliable Memoirs.
One of the great memoir titles ever.
It is a fantastic book. It is. He wrote it. He was 39 when he wrote it. He was 40 by the time it was published, and it's your typical kind of young man's look back at his coming of age, and at his lost homeland. It shares something with Nabokov's Speak Memory in that regard. He grew up in Sydney, Australia, but moved in his early 20s to London.
I love when he writes about in Australia that like everything, basically the second you step off the road, like everything wants to kill you.
Everything is wild. He writes great about spiders, about snakes. It's all very terrifying and very. He's such a nimble and funny writer. There's an aspect of reading the childhood stuff in Sydney and the suburbs. It's like the Little Rascals. He's running around barefoot all the time, and he gets locked in the outhouse, or the outhouse door opens while he's in there, and the girl he has a crush on is right across the street and sees him. There's this kind of high comedy or low comedy to what he's doing in a really appealing way.
Well, read us a little bit.
Sure. This is from the end of the book when he's already on the boat to London. It's an intellectual coming of age. It's also a sexual coming of age. And he's kind of always checking out the girls around him. And he is grumpy on this boat ride. This very short chapter on the boat to London rivals David Foster Wallace's much longer essay, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, about being on a cruise ship. Clive James was not on a cruise ship. He was just on kind of a passenger freighter to London. But one of the great lines in it at the beginning is, even a luxury liner is really just a bad place surrounded by water. It is a means of inducing hatred for your fellow men by trapping you in a confined space with too few of them to provide variety and too many to allow solitude. He says there are eligible women aboard, and they're all claimed before they've even left the harbor by the ship's crewmen. There were a couple of lines that really made me laugh. So both of these sentences talk about his kind of envy and resentment of the fact that all of those ladies ended up with the crew members. The first is, the Greek entertainments officer entertained us by organizing Greek dancing displays, in which the prettier girl passengers showed us the skills they had learned from the crew during the day. The skills they had learned from the crew during the night, we were left to imagine. And then along the same lines, on the next page, he says, the ship ground to a halt and waited for morning. It shook gently on the vibration of the girl passengers saying farewell to the crew.
All right.
He's very good with a punchline. He'll end a sentence on an unexpected way.
Juicy bits, courtesy of Clive James
and
via Greg Cowles. Yes. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.